Apollo was a death sentence dressed up as a triumph. 12 men walked on the moon. Every one of them rode to space inside a machine that shouldn't have worked, through radiation that nobody fully understood, onto a surface built to kill them in at least 6 different ways. And the only reason any of them came home is a combination of luck, paranoia, and engineering held together, quite literally, with aluminium foil and Velcro. Some of them came back with their eyes damaged. Some came back with hearts that would fail them decades later. Some of them never came back at all. This is the story of the most dangerous thing humans have ever done, and why we keep pretending it was safe. Before the first Apollo crew ever reached orbit, 3 of them were dead. On January 27, 1967, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee were strapped into the Apollo 1 command module on top of a Saturn 1B rocket at Cape Kennedy. It was a dress rehearsal. The rocket wasn't even fueled. The cabin was pressurized with pure oxygen at just over 16 pounds per square inch, slightly higher than sea level on Earth, which NASA had used on Mercury and Gemini missions without incident. In a sealed cabin of pure oxygen, ordinary materials become terrifying. Velcro burns like gunpowder. Aluminium glows. Fabric ignites from the heat of a filament, not from a flame. A spark in a frayed wire hit that oxygen-rich atmosphere. The fire climbed the walls of the capsule in seconds. The hatch opened inward, and the pressure inside the burning cabin was now higher than the pressure outside, which meant the hatch physically could not be pulled open. The 3 men were alive for somewhere between 15 and 30 seconds. None of them made it out. Grissom had complained about that hatch for months. He had also, in a now famous moment of frustration during testing earlier that day, asked how they were supposed to get to the moon if they couldn't even talk between 3 buildings. His last transmissions were screams. Apollo hadn't even started yet, and it had already killed. The investigation that followed rewrote the program from the wiring up. The hatch was redesigned to open outward and in seconds instead of minutes. Flammable materials were ripped out of the cabin and replaced. The pure oxygen atmosphere at launch was abandoned for a nitrogen and oxygen mix until the capsule reached orbit. The 3 astronauts who died paid for every safety improvement the rest of the program would depend on. Their names are on a plaque at Launch Complex 34, where the fire happened. The pad itself was never used again. The Saturn V that eventually took them to the moon is still the most powerful machine ever built for human flight. 36 stories tall, nearly 6 million pounds of fuel, a launch thrust equal to roughly 85 Hoover dams running at full capacity. What you are not often told is that every Apollo crew sat on top of what was, functionally, a controlled chemical bomb. The kerosene and liquid oxygen in the first stage, if the mixing went wrong, would detonate with the force of a small tactical nuclear weapon. Engineers had estimated the survival odds of a catastrophic Saturn V failure at 0. There was no abort option from most failure modes. If the rocket went, the crew went with it. The launch escape tower on top of the command module could, in theory, pull the astronauts clear of an explosion in the first few minutes. After that, they were on their own. And the tower itself had never been tested in a real crisis with a human crew on board. The entire system was a statistical gamble with human lives. On Apollo 12, lightning struck the rocket twice during ascent. Twice. The electrical systems scrambled, the guidance computer went offline, and the only reason the mission didn't end right there is that a 24-year-old flight controller named John Aaron remembered a test anomaly from a year earlier and told the crew to flip a switch called SCE to AUX. Nobody in mission control besides Aaron knew what that switch did. The commander didn't know either. He flipped it anyway. The systems came back. If Aaron had been out sick that day, Apollo 12 would have been written off in the first 2 minutes. Past the atmosphere, the real problem starts. Earth is wrapped in a magnetic field that deflects most of the charged particles streaming through the solar system. Every human being alive has spent their entire life inside that shield. The Apollo astronauts are the only people who have ever truly left it. The moment they crossed the outer boundary of the magnetosphere, they were exposed to galactic cosmic rays in a way no human body had ever been. These are not the same as solar radiation. Galactic cosmic rays are atomic nuclei accelerated to nearly the speed of light by events we still don't fully understand, likely supernova shockwaves from dying stars. When one of these particles hits a human body, it doesn't just deposit a small dose of energy. It rips through tissue like a bullet the size of a single atom, punching holes in DNA, in brain cells, in heart muscle, in the cells of the optical nerve. Every Apollo astronaut, during the quiet moments of the coast to the moon, reported seeing flashes of light with their eyes closed. Pale streaks, starbursts. Some described them as fireworks going off behind their eyelids. Nobody had warned them about it. Nobody knew what it was. Those flashes were cosmic rays passing directly through their eyeballs, through their retinas, through the vitreous fluid. Each flash was a single atomic particle, traveling at near light speed, punching a hole through the astronaut's head. They were being shot, constantly, by bullets they could neither see nor stop. The crew of Apollo 11 reported roughly one flash every few minutes while resting. Over a week-long mission, that adds up to hundreds of heavy particles tearing through brain tissue. No animal on Earth has ever evolved a defense against radiation like this, because no animal on Earth has ever needed one. Our entire biology assumes the magnetic shield is there. The Apollo crews are the only humans who ever tested what happens when it isn't. The Lunar Module, the vehicle that carried them from orbit down to the surface, was the most fragile spacecraft ever flown. Its walls were aluminium, and in some places, the skin was as thin as a few sheets of aluminium foil stacked together. You could push a pencil through parts of it. Grumman, the company that built it, had stripped every gram of unnecessary mass out of the design to save fuel, which meant removing anything that didn't absolutely need to be there. Radiation shielding was one of the things that didn't make the cut. The windows were triangular, not for aesthetics, but because that shape could be smaller and lighter. The astronauts stood during the descent because seats would have added weight. There was no toilet. The landing gear was designed to crumple on impact to absorb force, which meant every landing permanently damaged the vehicle in ways that would have been unacceptable on any machine flown inside an atmosphere. On the surface, with the sun shining, a significant solar flare would have ended the mission instantly. No warning, no shelter. The two astronauts inside the LEM would have received a fatal dose of radiation in under an hour. Mission planners knew this. They watched the sun carefully every day of every mission, and they got lucky. Apollo ran for 3.5 years without being caught outside Earth's magnetic shield during a major solar event. A flare on the scale of the August 1972 storm, which happened 4 months after Apollo 16 returned and 4 months before Apollo 17 launched, would have killed any crew on the lunar surface. The astronauts were not protected from that storm. The calendar was. When Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended toward the Sea of Tranquility on July 20, 1969, the guidance computer began throwing error codes. The codes were called 1201 and 1202, program alarms, and they indicated that the computer was being asked to do more than it could handle. It was overflowing. In Houston, a 26-year-old engineer named Steve Bales had about 15 seconds to decide whether to abort the landing or let it continue. He gave a thumbs up. The landing proceeded. Armstrong then noticed that the autopilot was taking them directly into a boulder field the size of a football stadium, with rocks the size of cars. He took manual control. As he hunted for a clear patch of ground, the fuel gauge began counting down. When the Eagle finally touched down, Armstrong had approximately 17 seconds of fuel remaining before mission rules would have forced him to abort. 17 seconds. If he had taken much longer, he would have been required to fire the ascent engine immediately, abandoning the descent stage on the Moon, and the first attempt to land humans on another world would have ended in retreat. If he had pressed on past zero fuel, trying to land, they would have crashed. Either way, Richard Nixon had already approved a eulogy written by speechwriter William Safire titled "In Event of Moon Disaster." The speech assumed Armstrong and Aldrin would be stranded on the lunar surface. It was meant to be read on national television as the two men slowly died of suffocation or starvation, whichever came first, while the world listened. He fixed it with a felt-tip pen. He jammed the marker into the broken breaker socket, pushed it far enough to make contact, and the engine fired. They went home. The history of Apollo is full of moments like that. Improvised fixes, duct tape. The entire program survived on the margin of what could be jury-rigged in real time. Apollo 13 was supposed to be the third lunar landing. Instead, an oxygen tank exploded 200,000 miles from Earth, crippling the command module and turning a routine mission into a 4-day survival problem, with 3 men breathing increasingly stale air in a spacecraft designed for 2. The carbon dioxide scrubbers in the Lunar Module, which the crew was now using as a lifeboat, were the wrong shape for the cartridges from the command module. The 3 astronauts had to build an adapter out of a plastic bag, cardboard from the flight plan cover, and duct tape, following verbal instructions radioed up from Houston. They called it the mailbox. It worked. The cabin temperature dropped to around 3 degrees Celsius. The crew stopped drinking water to conserve power, and all 3 became severely dehydrated. Fred Hayes developed a kidney infection that would sideline him for weeks after landing. Jack Swigert, the command module pilot, who had been added to the crew at the last minute because Ken Mattingly had been exposed to German measles, manually calculated navigation corrections using a slide rule and a wristwatch, while the spacecraft drifted with most of its systems shut down. They came home. Barely. Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert would all later say they were surprised to be alive. Apollo 13 was classified as a successful failure. What gets lost in that phrase is that every other Apollo mission had the same systems, the same tanks, the same design. Any one of them could have been Apollo 13. The accident was not an anomaly. It was a probability that finally came due. The final threat was coming home. Apollo command modules re-entered Earth's atmosphere at speeds exceeding 24,500 miles per hour. At that velocity, the air in front of the capsule compresses so violently that it ionizes and turns into plasma, a superheated gas reaching temperatures of around 2,700 degrees Celsius. That's hot enough to vaporize steel. The heat shield, an ablative material called AVCOAT, was designed to burn off in controlled layers, carrying heat away from the capsule. If the angle of re-entry was even slightly off, either too steep or too shallow, the heat shield would fail. Too steep, and the capsule burns through. Too shallow, and it skips off the atmosphere like a stone on water, and the crew drifts back into space to die of suffocation. The acceptable corridor was narrow enough that hitting it was compared to threading a needle the size of a basketball hoop from 100 miles away in the dark while on fire. During the worst of the re-entry, the plasma sheath around the capsule blocks all radio communication. For several minutes, Mission Control has no idea whether the crew is alive or whether the spacecraft has disintegrated. The astronauts inside can see the plasma burning outside the windows, a flickering orange and pink glow that some compared to being inside a blast furnace. They cannot call for help. They cannot change course. They cannot do anything except wait to find out whether the heat shield held. For the astronauts who did make it home, the damage wasn't always visible. A 2016 study led by Dr. Michael Delp at Florida State University looked at the causes of death among Apollo astronauts who had flown to deep space and compared them to astronauts who had only flown in low Earth orbit, and to astronauts who had never flown at all. The Apollo group, the only humans in history to leave the protective shield of Earth's magnetosphere, died of cardiovascular disease at more than 4 times the rate of their non-flying colleagues. The effect was not seen in astronauts who had only orbited Earth. Deep space radiation, the study suggested, was doing long-term damage to the cells lining the astronauts' blood vessels. Slow damage. Cumulative damage. Damage that took decades to kill them. Alan Shepard, the first American in space and the 5th man to walk on the moon, died of leukemia in 1998. Jim Irwin of Apollo 15, who had suffered a heart arrhythmia on the lunar surface, had his first heart attack a year after returning and died of a final one in 1991 at age 61. Ed Mitchell from Apollo 14 died in 2016. Neil Armstrong died of complications from heart surgery in 2012. Whether these deaths are coincidence or consequence is still scientifically contested. The sample size is small. Only 24 men ever left low Earth orbit, and only 12 walked on the moon. Statistics do not love such numbers.
But those 12 men received more deep space radiation than any humans before or since. And whatever it did to them, we learned from their bodies. The psychological toll was harder to measure, but just as real. Buzz Aldrin returned to Earth and spiraled into alcoholism and severe depression. He later wrote that coming home from the moon was harder than going. Everything on Earth felt small and pointless after what he had seen. Charles Duke struggled with similar feelings for years. Edgar Mitchell had a profound experience on the return flight, a sense of cosmic unity that he spent the rest of his life trying to understand, eventually leaving NASA to found an institute dedicated to studying consciousness. The men who walked on another world came back to a planet that no longer quite fit them. They had been somewhere no human was built to go. Some part of them never fully returned. Apollo is remembered as a triumph. It was a triumph. But the story America has told itself about those missions, flags planted, golf balls hit, footprints left, is the clean version, the one you learn in school. The real version is that 24 men rode fire into a vacuum nobody understood, aimed at a rock nobody had visited, inside a spacecraft built of foil and glue, through radiation that was still punching holes in their retinas when they landed. The real version is that some of them watched their friends burn alive before the program even started. The real version is that the only reason any of them came home is that nothing caught fire at the wrong moment, no solar flare peaked on the wrong day, no plastic switch stayed broken for 1 minute too long.
We got away with it. 12 men walked on the moon, and 12 men came back. The next time humans leave Earth, it will not be a Saturn V with a paper-thin lunar module and a felt-tip pen for a backup plan. It will be more careful. It will have to be, because we now know what Apollo didn't. The moon isn't a destination. It is a place that lets you visit, and if it feels like it, lets you leave. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.